ignored humanity in the building of our places and our public spaces for the last 40 years.
This continuing diminishing of the quality of life of more and more Americans. And we fundamentally have to change our approach to this.
The human being has to be the essential planning component and the scale around which everything is measured, not the automobile.
I think we need to find a new vision for how people live.
Vision. It's all about the vision. You know, where there is no vision, the people perish.
For the longest time, we were building our buildings and we were building our neighborhoods in ways that were completely out of scale with human beings.
Trade-offs. People have made their peace with the trade-off.
But you invest essentially in a massive highway system and you will get sprawl, congestion, and pollution.
Every single trip has to be made by the car.
You can go virtually any city in any state, any major city, and you are very, very pressed to come up with the public dollars to keep extending freeways, extending utilities, to basically provide the infrastructure of sprawl. It's just too expensive.
I don't expect people to get out of their car just because they think environmentally that's what they should be doing. It's got to work.
We absolutely have to be doing better because it's the future.
Well, it reminds me of Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
I wish. Of course you do. You wish for the things boys dream of. I wish. What does a small boy wish for?
Say, isn't that Jimmy Jones? They say he's the richest man in Texas. Richest man in the world? Look at that, he's got a new Chevy. When Jones wants something, he gets it.
I heard that, partner.
Sorry, no offense. Sorry, Mr. Jones.
Powerful man with a powerful car.
I wish.
Gee, I wish I was old enough to drive.
For as long as most Americans can remember, the car has been an icon of the American dream. It stirred our emotions and embodied our notions of freedom, wealth, and independence. At the same time, it reinforced our vision of a bright and shiny future.
The smoothness of Oldsmobile's new Hydromatic, the smartness of Futuramic design.
A patriotic vision built with American ingenuity and know-how.
I took me a press, I took me some steel, I took my 2 hands and built an automobile.
In many ways, the car has defined us, both individually and as a nation. It's been a status symbol, revealing our success and proclaiming, we've arrived.
98, a signature that is a hallmark of motorcar elegance. Elegance in the grand manner.
We gave cars names that symbolized our might and muscle. Names that expressed our restless pioneering spirits.
As the new Buick Wildcat for 64. When you go the way of the Wildcat, people take notice. They want to know more about your car.
A car, a tank of gas, and nothing but the open road before you. It gave a sense of security and achievement. There was no place you couldn't go.
One summer day, take one car, some good friends, add sand.
We were truly in charge of our destinies. We were free to go where we wanted to go, see what we wanted to see, do what we wanted to do, and live where we wanted to live.
No other automobile offers so much of what so many people desire.
Not much has changed in the last 50 years. Automakers continue to help us define ourselves by the rugged names of the cars we drive. We are pathfinders, trailblazers. We venture into the unknown. Ford tells us we are explorers, taking excursions on an expedition into uncharted territory. But with our growing population of more than 300 million and more than 250 million cars and light trucks on our roads, Americans have become slaves to this freedom. What started out as a transportation choice has become our only option. Our love affair with the automobile is fading.
In performance, it's a star. It's a rocket engine car, futuramic through and through. It has hydromatic too. When you make a date with the 88, there's a big new thrill for you.
As population continues to grow in the U.S., which it will continue to do, we don't have enough room to accommodate all those cars. We can't build the freeways, we can't build the roads, and still have places that have any kind of quality or character to them.
For decades, the common solution to congestion on highways or freeways was adding a lane or adding several lanes, as if continually adding lanes is going to solve our congestion problems as growth occurs. Well, the reality is, and we know today, that in fact adding lanes only induces more congestion. And what's amazing about it, if you think about it, is we spend billions of dollars in our road systems and expanding road systems. In the planning of these, the planners can project at what point in time in the future, 20 years from now or 30 years from now, whatever it may be, that we'll be at the same point of congestion or worse than we are today. Most of the time when we widen freeways or elevate freeways, we use public money to devalue private real estate. It doesn't sound very American to me.
Perfectly predictable results. I mean, I've been on I-25 at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon coming up from the south, and it's like being on the 405 in Los Angeles. I mean, stop and go for 25 miles. And I know the state is adding another lane. And I think the environmental impact statement said that it would reduce commute time by 1 minute out of 48. Now, why would you spend all this money to add a lane to an interstate so you'd reduce commute time by 1 minute? Doesn't make any sense to me.
Population rose 5% during the 1990s in the Boston region. Auto ownership went up, I think, by 25 or 30%. Hours lost to congestion went up 50%, because we finally reached the point where we just couldn't add more lanes and traffic really started to slow. This has translated into much greater concern about commute times.
Most people's commutes have increased by 9 to 12 minutes. So used to take 20, 25 minutes to get to work. Now it takes 35, 40 minutes to get to work. That's a function of increased vehicle miles traveled. So people are driving further, it's taking longer, and they're making choices to do that.
If the amount we drive continues to increase as it has over the past 20 years, the vehicle miles traveled by the average American will grow by more than 58% by the year 2025. Just how much will this impact us economically, environmentally, and socially? Americans lose $64 billion a year by being stuck in traffic. This figure will swell to 3 times that amount if the current growth rate continues. How much will this new traffic compound the already existing problem of air pollution within our cities? Currently, automobiles are responsible for a full third of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Even with technological advances in the automotive industry, reducing emissions won't be enough to change the pollution level. Population growth is a key factor. However, the greatest contributor to increased automobile use is our suburban pattern of city planning. This forces us into choices that, more and more, place us behind the wheels of our automobiles.
sometimes called the American dream, sometimes called the American way of life. We call it suburbia. I sometimes joke around, call it the happy motoring utopia or the drive-in utopia. It's an extreme car-dependent living arrangement.
My understanding is that roughly 20% of the trips that we make are work-related trips. The other 80% are non-work related. And what that means is they're, shuttling kids to soccer practice or running errands or shopping. 80% of our trips, that's significant numbers.
If you really begin looking at the roots of why we've had this incredible increase in vehicle miles traveled, in number of car trips per day per family. I mean, we're up around 13 or 14 car trips per family per day. It's, to me, unfathomable until you actually look at people's, our lifestyles have become so segmented.
The increase in vehicle miles traveled, people traveling more, it's because we've spread ourselves out. We've spread ourselves out flat, and people are just saying, to get to certain places, to get to certain services, they have to drive further and further. And it's because of the discretionary trips. People are taking a lot of, pulling the car out of the driveway to go and make simple errands, and it's adding up. And that's why the streets, we can't build ourselves out of this congestion problem because those conditions will continue.
The problem with continuing with the way that we've been growing for the last 50 years is that we can't afford it in any way, shape, or form. We can't afford it on an environmental level. We can't afford to be stuck in traffic forever. We can't build our way out of the problem because we don't have enough money to build enough freeways to accommodate all the traffic that is generated from growing ever outward. And we can't afford the actual weight and cost of the disinvestment in cities.
Americans have built about 16 million lane miles of roads and highways. This infrastructure is aging and in dire need of repair. Civil engineering experts recommend that we spend almost $2 trillion to fix this problem. The national debt has surpassed the U.S. historical high of $9 trillion. As a result, experts are beginning to question the wisdom of continued investment in an infrastructure that increasingly provides diminishing returns.
What you've got with the suburban living arrangement and all of its accessories can be described as the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. Very simply. And the reason is this, that it is a living arrangement that doesn't have a future. And so we're stuck in that particular box. And given that stuckness, we use every means possible to mask the problem and to deny the problem and to continue behaving the way we've been behaving. And we are going to continue behaving that way until we get some shock to the system that prompts us to behave differently.
This 911. The bridge collapsed. Where at? In downtown Minneapolis. People are all over the place. Emergency, or can you hold?
Everything you've got, the whole bridge over the river fell down.
Into the middle of the bridge, and everything just started shaking.
I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw the bridge and all the cars on it just dropping down out of sight.
A bridge in America just shouldn't fall down.
The tragic event on August 1st, 2007 gripped the community of Minneapolis, Minnesota. It caused our nation to pause and grieve the senseless loss of human lives. The bridge collapse brought into focus what many experts in the civil engineering community had been warning our government of for quite some time. It exposed the imminent dangers we face as a result of our aging infrastructure.
By the way, there was a report that came out from whatever the name of the American Association of Engineers is. I don't know what it officially is called, Society for Engineers or something. But you know, it was their report card on American infrastructure, including bridges, tunnels, highways, you know, all the stuff of normal daily life. And they gave the country something like a C- or a D. For the, you know, so much of our stuff is so badly in need of either repair or replacement, and we are not going to have the money to do that.
Was the tragic collapse of the I-35 West Bridge the wake-up call? Is further investment into this deteriorating infrastructure in the name of saving lives the answer? Or is this debate simply masking an even larger problem?
A significant number of petroleum geologists believe that in this decade, and perhaps already, we have reached global peak oil production, something that happened in 1970 in America, where half of all the oil that we can get out of the ground has been taken out, most of it in the last 60 years. If that is true, given the rise of India and China and others coming along behind, we could be out of recoverable oil in somewhere between 35 and 50 years if present consumption patterns continue. And that's caused...
The discussion of how much oil endowment is left in the world is being evaluated by a number of groups. Some of them fall into a peak camp, and they discuss peak oil. Comes from M. King Hubbard's pioneering work, who worked at Shell and at the USGS. The peak oil analogy worked in the lower 48. M. King did several series of studies and finally came to a number. In truth, there was peaking in the time frame that he suggested in these later estimates. M. King himself, though, talked about the interruption of that simple model with quota systems and technological advances that allow for a more complex model.
To appreciate again the situation of our modern industrial society is contrasted, say, with the past future with regard to the fossil fuels, or to appreciate the fossil fuels in human history. I've taken this time span here from 5,000 years ago.
Even M. King Hubbard's pioneering peak oil model stated that technological advances in oil recovery would give rise to increases in oil reserve estimates. As a result, the oil industry has dramatically improved the yield of existing oil fields, sustaining production longer. However, most credible experts acknowledge that these advances do not alter the reality that oil is a finite resource. This is a message we can't afford to ignore.
We studied global oil, natural gas liquids in a 5-year effort, consolidated, intensive effort. The results of all that, of essentially a 3 trillion barrel endowment at some kind of central tendency for our estimates, and there's a range of estimates, is a fairly sobering exercise. If we've used now, in the way Chevron summarizes in their evaluation, we've used 1 trillion barrels of oil, we have 1 trillion barrels of oil in reserves, and 1 trillion barrels yet to find and produce. And so the data of that assessment of January 1st, 1996, and 300 billion barrels plus have been subtracted from reserves is sobering.
Currently, the world population uses about 30 billion barrels of oil per year. With anticipated growth in demand of 50%, we will be consuming 45 billion barrels per year by 2020. Combined with the fact that we have already used 300 billion barrels of the global oil reserves, this raises serious concerns and begs the question, when will our demand for oil outpace the Earth's ability to supply it?
We did not make estimates of peak or plateaus of production in our studies, but many people have used our data to make such estimates. I think the thing that is striking about that, using our own data at the central tendency for the Western nations, nearer term concerns about demand exceeding supply in the 2010 to 2015 range with our data that we provided is concerning.
How much oil is on the planet? There's a lot of dispute about this. It's clear that we will use more oil in the next 100 years than we have used in the past 100 years. I don't believe that half of the world's oil is gone. But peak oil is about rates of delivery, not about the resource availability. And much of the oil that's left is going to be slow, arduous, and expensive. It's going to be very difficult to get, and we're not going to deliver it at the same rates that we've delivered the cheap, easy oil that we produced in the last half century.
The concept of peaking, or I prefer to talk about plateauing, and we add reserves as needed. The problem for me with the plateauing concept is we cannot change infrastructure quickly enough. We don't have the manpower, we don't have the equipment to rapidly increase supply as demand increases more rapidly than expected, and so that creates the pressure to utilize these resources as carefully and well as we can. It's not a forever resource.
The problem with that is not running out of oil. This is something that's poorly understood by the public, because we're not going to run out of oil. Even when we get into terrible, terrible trouble, there will still be oil in the ground. It just may not be economical to lift it out.
Interruptions in the supply of oil are not new to American consumers. The Hurricane Katrina catastrophe in 2005 severely damaged much of the oil infrastructure in the Gulf, wreaking havoc on the refineries there. This caused fuel shortages, which doubled the price of gas and diesel. By and large, consumers absorbed these increases without complaint. Many took comfort in the fact that gas was still available, unlike the oil shocks of the 1970s, when gas lines were commonplace, out-of-gas signs littered our cities, and tempers flared.
Blame them. They do sit out there for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours some days, and their tempers are awfully short.
We just can't give you any today. We can give it to you tomorrow, now that'll be an even day.
My son to the doctor's today.
Well, I'm sorry.
Americans became much more conscious about their fuel consumption. Economy cars were prevalent. Power plants switched from oil to coal and natural gas. And Americans found ways to conserve fuel by carpooling and driving at lower speeds. Reflecting on our experience from the 70s, many feel that we can weather the coming energy crisis in much the same way we did in the past. But this time, the cause is much different, and the solutions will not be so easy.
In the 1970s, we had what was in a way an artificial crisis. It was a crunch, but it was a short-term crunch, and the seeds of its failure were planted the moment the embargo began, because 3 great new oil provinces had been discovered: the North Sea, Prudhoe Bay in Alaska, and Cantarell in Mexico. These 3 great provinces, within a decade, would bring a flood of new, inexpensive oil onto the world market. And that killed the oil crisis of the 1970s. At that point in our history, we had lots of time, lots of money. We were very rich. This time around, we're going to be constrained on money, on capital, and above all, on time. And time is the resource people do not really understand. Money, if you don't spend it today, you can spend it tomorrow. Time not used wisely today is lost forever.
The demand for oil is projected to increase from currently about 80 million barrels a day to 120 million barrels a day by 2020. And this is far in excess of the demands in the early 70s. In an increasingly restricted supply, geographically restricted. So this adds a new dynamic to the entire supply issue and competition for that supply. So this is not the 70s revisited. This is an entirely new world at a much higher demand level than in the past.
The global economy is growing at a voracious pace. With the emergence of the middle class in China and India, the demand for oil will accelerate. As these nations strive for a higher standard of living, they will inevitably adopt the car as their transportation of choice. China plans 65,000 miles of expressways. This dwarfs the U.S. system of 48,000 miles. Right now, only 1% of China's 1.3 billion people own a car. Even a marginal 10% increase in auto ownership will have a devastating impact on global oil supply.
There are 2.8 billion people in China and India that have come very late to the petroleum party. The mistake they're making is trying to emulate U.S. land use patterns, U.S. transportation systems. The automobile in China and India is going to be a disaster. Car culture in the United States is a near disaster. It's a guaranteed disaster in those countries.
I was in Beijing and there was a lot of bicycles in 1997, and there's less dependence on bicycles and more dependence on automobiles all the time. They're becoming much more affluent. All of this requires increased energy consumption, increased electrical generation utilizing oil. All is putting a tremendous strain on the oil supplies, and with their economic power, it's very much a direct competition with our needs in the United States.
We criticize the Chinese. You're using too much oil. We're still using 3 times more than they are in China, even though they have 4 times more people than we do. The Chinese argue, hey, we came late to the party, but maybe some of this petroleum belongs to us. There's nothing inscrutable about what the Chinese are doing. They're taking our Walmart dollars, the money we spend in Walmart, and they're going overseas and buying energy assets in the Sudan, in Venezuela, in Canada. They're much less naive about the role of petroleum in the future than we are here in America.
After World War II, the U.S. was the wealthiest nation in the world. America's prosperity was based on cheap energy, and we were blessed with the second largest oil supply in the world. We thought it would never end. But a mere 25 years later, we had recklessly used up more than 50% of this abundant supply. We were forced to get in line with all the other dependent nations and begin importing our oil from overseas. And what has changed since then? Nothing. Each year we consume more oil. Each year we build more highways. Each year brings to market larger and larger vehicles that further our dependence on foreign oil.
We have built an entire civilization around $20 oil, $30 oil. It's not designed for $80 oil, $100 oil, $150 oil. And in the civilization, the way we've designed our landscape, our cities, our subdivisions, our urban neighborhoods, we've locked many people into using oil. They have to use gasoline or diesel to get to work, to get home, to pick the kids up, to go to the soccer game. The entire civilization assumes inexpensive petroleum forever. And it's that cheap oil that's disappearing now.
The International Energy Agency predicts that demand for oil will continue to increase, particularly in developing countries, and urges governments to take immediate, bold actions in their energy policies, or face an imminent supply crisis in the coming decades.
If we get an interruption in the U.S. of, say, not 3 to 5%, but 10%, then we may have a problem, because this country is too dependent on liquid fuels to tolerate a massive effect, and 10% may sound small, but it's actually significant, in our transportation sector. And without the transportation sector, we have problems delivering food, we have problems delivering things by rail, manufactured goods and so forth. So we have a pretty serious problem that I'm not aware we've planned on.
Here in the United States, we're now consuming about 3 gallons of petroleum per person per day. That's 20 pounds of oil per person per day. We only consume about 4 pounds of oxygen per person per day. We're consuming 5 times more oil each day here in the United States than we are oxygen. We've become the oil tribe.
Whoa! She drove herself in! Yay! You're rich, mister! There's yeast in the buckwheat!
The consensus among many of the top executives of the major oil suppliers is that oil prices will remain high, with the majority predicting further increases in the future. Can the average family budget withstand these increases? What financial choices will we be forced to make as fuel for our cars takes a larger and larger percentage of our household income?
You know, we spend in America easily 25% of our disposable income on automobiles, getting around. So we're paying a huge premium for the right to sit in traffic on the freeways.
In America, by relying primarily on one mode of transportation, namely the private automobile, we have developed the most expensive transportation system in the world. Typically, in the average American household budget, transportation is now number 2 only to housing in the amount of the budget that is consumed. In fact, for the average household, about 19% of their budget is consumed owning and operating and maintaining the automobile.
On transportation system fuel alone, I would say probably $250 to $300 a month.
That sometimes is 2 fills a tank. I mean, you're looking at close to a $1,000 gas bill a month, so that would affect me a lot.
Stating as it is, there's days we have to choose between cheap hamburger and gas.
I'm already living hand to mouth, so I mean, it couldn't make things any easier.
Need to get back and forth to work, so of course our children don't have health care at this moment. It's one or the other.
People are spending over $1,000 a month on transportation because every single trip has to be made by the car. Your kids can't walk to school, you can't go to the grocery store without a car, you can't go to work without a car, you can't do anything without driving.
Beyond just the average number of 19% per household, we know it varies by income level. For very high income level people, their transportation costs may only be 5% of their budget. But we know for low income people, relying on the automobile requires as much as 40% of their household income. This is money that it could have gone for food or medical care or any one of a number of other things, but instead goes to transportation.
So I think that, honestly, I don't think we'll see an end to oil, although I think that the damage of burning fossil fuels is going to end up hurting us way before we ever run out of oil.
Do I think it'll happen? No.
You know, we've been following the assumption in our society that all these things are a matter of choice. You know, it's like under the mandates of TV advertising, we've been brainwashed into thinking everything's choice, you know, what kind of product you buy, you know, what kind of lifestyle you have, you know, whether you submit to global warming or not, whether you submit to an energy predicament or not, you know, whether the collapse of a global economy is something that you choose or not. You know, these aren't things that you choose. These are circumstances that reality presents to you, and then you have to behave according to what reality demands. and what reality requires. So this whole idea in America that we're, that we are so omnipotent that we can simply just choose stuff, is going to really come back and bite us in the ass.
Deficit more important than healthcare, more important than anything, is we have got to do something about our energy strategy. Because if we permit the climate to continue to warm at an unsustainable rate, and if we keep on doing what we're doing till we're out of oil and we haven't made the transition, then it's inconceivable to me that our children and grandchildren will be able to maintain the American way of life, and that the world won't be much fuller of resource-based wars of all kinds. And you really could have all those Mel Gibson road warrior movies could look more and more like reality 100 years from now.
Is oil the lifeblood that sustains us? If so, what lengths will we be willing to go to secure it? What will we be willing to sacrifice?
Oil is the original currency. Oil is the original source of wealth. And as oil becomes more expensive, the desire or the likelihood or the risk that we will fight over oil will grow. And we're going to see this combat take place in the value of the US dollar, in trade deficits. It might have a military component too. Indeed, you can argue it already does. Animals fight over energy all the time. Grizzly bears fight on salmon streams. Trees try to shade other trees. Energy is the source of all wealth, and petroleum is the most valuable source of energy. It's only natural that we will fight over it.
Just my heart and my mind, I can be driving home, loosely on the seat. I get out of my car, step into the night, and look up at the sky. And there's something bright traveling fast. Just look at it.
There's a lady who lived in my town who was driving a Ford Expedition or Explorer or some giant car, and she had a bumper sticker that said, "War is not the answer." And every time I actually ran into her, I would say, "Hey, war is the answer. If that's how you want to live, then war is the answer. Stop complaining about it. Get used to it."
Watching the storm start to form over America. Can't do anything, just watch them swing with the wind out to sea.
Our misadventure in Iraq has been all about an attempt to moderate and influence the behavior of the nations in the Middle East, most particularly Iran and Saudi Arabia. Here's the thing that I think Americans have to consider. Sooner or later, we're going to have to withdraw from our positions in the Middle East. We're not going to be able to maintain a gigantic military force there forever. And how long is that going to be? You know, is it going to be 12 months or 36 months or 4 years? You know, we don't really know. But when that happens and America loses its ability to really influence anything that goes on there, you know, where will our oil resources come from?
Yeah, if we think about the military option a bit more, we understand how expensive it is by the Iraq experience, and also how we are curtailed ourselves from doing that repeatedly around the world. We simply have strained our military, our economic engine, and so forth in Iraq, from which we've basically gained no oil, although there's an oil dimension to it. And we can't undertake this in several different countries.
The temptation to secure petroleum resources through military action is a response we will not be able to afford, economically or morally. It's clear that the U.S. national security policy will be dictated by the U.S. national energy policy. Our search for alternative or unconventional petroleum could, and probably will, lead to some irrational decisions.
You know, then you see some really weird things happening. America, forget it, we're crapped out for oil, basically. Venezuela, you know what, are we going to have war with Venezuela and take them over? Well, they're past peak anyway. The quality of their oil is generally, it's heavy or sour crude, and it's not great oil. Mexico is crapped out. It's in the process of crapping out. There's Canada, and they have a lot of tar sands, but they're very expensive to produce. It's not cheap oil.
There's 1 trillion barrels of Canadian tar sands. We'll be lucky to produce more than 2 or 3 million barrels a day of oil from the tar sands, because it'll be limited by water availability and by available supplies of natural gas. In Venezuela, there's 500 billion or 800 billion barrels of bitumen, almost as much oil as we've used in the last 40 or 50 years. But that oil is going to come out at the rate of 1 million barrels a day, about 1% of the oil we're currently consuming. And so to pretend that there are these large, enormous reserves of unconventional oil and that they can take the place of light conventional oil is just a mistake. It's an illusion.
There are still plentiful supplies of coal, and if used wisely, we can fuel electrical generation long into our future. By researching and implementing solar, wind, and hydroelectric technologies, scientists and engineers are looking beyond fossil fuels to clean-burning, renewable energy resources. These efforts promise to extend our remaining fossil fuels into the future and could help us find new forms of renewable energy that could sustain us for millennia to come. However, the prospect of exhausting our oil supplies brings with it a whole set of different issues. Petroleum is unique. It is intimately related to the transportation infrastructure we rely on. 95% of all petroleum produced today is dedicated to transportation. Dependence on petroleum has placed humanity in a vulnerable position, particularly in America, where personal transportation has become a way of life. We must urge our policymakers not to choose solutions which only treat the symptoms while falling short of a cure.
The President of the United States.
As we find ourselves getting in trouble with this package of the American way of life, the suburban way of life, I think we're going to unfortunately have a huge campaign mounted by the politicians who represent the public sentiment, to maintain the unmaintainable and sustain the unsustainable. And it's going to be a tremendous waste of our resources to try to prop up this suburban way of life. But we're probably going to do it anyway.
Competitive requires affordable energy. And here we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil, which is often imported from unstable parts of the world. The best way to break this addiction is through technology.
There's a lot of delusional thinking that's now mounting up in our society. As some people apprehend that we may have a problem with this, there's a belief, a delusion, that there is a rescue remedy out there that's going to save us. There is a delusion that if we wish hard enough, that we'll find some magical alternative fuel that will allow us to run all the cars that we're running the way we're running them. There's a wish that the housing bubble industry will be able to continue, so all those highly paid construction jobs will still be there. You know, there's a wish that some mythical they will come up with some kind of technological solution to the problem. You know, a lot of the American public doesn't even understand that there's a difference between energy and technology, that they're not the same thing. One of the themes that you now hear all over America, including the TV news media, is that if you have a problem with energy, you just plug in technology instead as a replacement. Well, that's a complete misunderstanding of reality. You know, energy and technology are different things. And if you run out of one, you can't necessarily plug in the other. Technology runs on energy.
Increase our research in better batteries for hybrid and electric cars and in pollution-free cars that run on hydrogen. We will also fund additional research in cutting-edge methods of producing ethanol, not just from corn, but from wood chips and stalks or switchgrass. Our goal is to make...
If we looked at the extreme case of how much ethanol could we actually produce, let's say corn ethanol, in this country, we simply can't make a dent in our demand. If we took all the big 11 central, most fertile agricultural states in this country, got rid of all the crops that are grown there now, made every square inch 100% ethanol, it would not even achieve 50% of the liquid fuel demand that we have right now, let alone the growth in the future.
I don't believe that any combination of alternative fuels is going to allow us to run what we run in the U.S. the way we're running it. We are not going to run the interstate highway system, Walmart, and Disney World on any combination of tar sands, coal liquids, ethanol, biodiesel, hydrogen, or used French fried potato oil. It ain't going to happen. There's a huge wish out there that we could, but it won't happen.
Everybody wants a panacea. They want soy diesel. They want corn ethanol. They want hydrogen. They want some way to keep the magic carpet ride going. But the truth is, there's no single alternative that can replace petroleum in the volumes at which we're using it today. We're going to need a host of small solutions, all of which will be important, but none of which can fully replace the petroleum we're using today.
We're going to use all of these things in one way or another. And I'm not saying that I'm against the idea of using alternative fuels, but we're going to be very disappointed in what they can actually do for us. And we're probably going to be disappointed in the level and quality of innovation that comes along. There's not going to be a rescue remedy for this.
The talent and technology of America, this country can dramatically improve our environment, move beyond a petroleum-based economy, and make our dependence on Middle Eastern oil a thing of the past.
Energy independence for the United States is an admirable goal and has been discussed for many years, and we are increasingly dependent on foreign supplies of oil, natural gas, and uranium in spite of efforts to the contrary. And so a laudable goal, difficult to achieve. I see us importing hydrocarbons for a long time.
Let me put it this way. You know, if America could harness the energy that it would get from blowing smoke up its own ass, we would solve the energy problem.
Yes, the automobile has provided us unparalleled mobility, and it will continue to play an important role in our transportation. But our dependence on the convenience the automobile provides must end. Contrary to popular belief, Americans are not addicted to oil. Americans are addicted to unencumbered transportation, and it is this addiction we must address to ensure that the American dream does not become the American nightmare.
The urbanization and suburbanization of the U.S., which is unique compared to most world developed nations, has come at a cost, and the cost is in high vehicle usage, high numbers of vehicles, and not the most fuel-efficient vehicles, and that will have to change.
We can double new car efficiency as we did between 1972 and 1985. We can do that again, and it's probably job one. But there are other things we need to do. Reinvest in public transportation. We need to rethink about how we're designing cities and subdivisions and neighborhoods. We have to think, how are we going to get this incredible civilization from today, 2008, how are you going to get that civilization to 2100? Nobody in the United States has a clue. It's a question we haven't answered.
What we're really going to have to do is make other arrangements for daily life in America.
It is a well-established fact in this time of the history of cities that after a long period where we did these monofunctional city districts, that all residences are here, all factories are here, all offices are here, all schools are here, that we have realized the shortcomings of that planning model.
One of the biggest mistakes in land use planning was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, where we segregated housing from commercial development, from industrial development. And by the way, it was not just the developer doing this, it was the consumer doing it. We wanted to segregate ourselves in separate units, and then we had to depend upon the car then to get from work to back home, or vice versa, or get from home to the hospital, or get from home to the grocery store. We designed our way into forcing ourselves to use the automobile.
We very arrogantly, in my opinion, just tossed out the window 2,000 years of accumulated wisdom when it came to human settlement post-World War II. We were in the modern era. We believed that tomorrow was going to be better than yesterday. We believed that we were smarter, that the machine was reinventing the way we lived our lives. And we very boldly, and I think at times arrogantly, presumed that we could create a completely different world detached from the historical progression of human settlement.
I think we got crazy for 50 years, from 1950 to 2000, with this machine. But I think that now one city after the other are realizing that we shall balance the various concerns in cities much better than making it all for the automobile.
Why? Because we essentially allowed virtually unlimited development along the highway, thereby destroying it as an effective highway. Why did we do this? Well, we didn't understand the impact of what we were doing at the time. You know, everybody wanted to drive. Everybody wanted that little house in the suburbs. 4% mortgage money, particularly if you were returning GI after World War II. And you could buy a house for $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. And who would blame people at the time who wanted to move out of cold water flats and urban slums and get their piece of the American dream? Unfortunately, we forgot about how we were going to get people home to work and back again. And I think we're finally beginning to recognize just what we did to ourselves.
Every day, our civic leaders grapple with the ever-increasing strain that suburban growth has placed upon our city services. The cost of building and maintaining our sprawling web of roads, utilities, schools, fire stations, police services, and hospitals has pushed city budgets to their breaking point. These are but a few of the unintended consequences that 50 years of unchecked suburban development have wrought. We must create city planning and building practices that will provide a sustainable future for our growing population. We must rediscover the ability of public transportation to guide future growth.
We can reframe how we grow into ways that consider environment, economic health, equity. We're going to be able to set the path toward a better future.
We are basically a slow-moving, walking animal. If we remember that when we do our designs, we are well on the track to something which we can immediately relate to as human beings. And that is, again, that is an art which has been partly lost during all these senseless years with the flirtation with the automobile, where we've started to make all the cities 60 km/h architecture or 50 miles an hour architecture instead of 3 miles an hour architecture, which are the architecture for mankind.
It's walking that's the big alternative. They're all a kind of trips that people take to parks and for recreation, that's all internalized and walkable. Trips to school, internalized and walkable. The local shopping with a grocery store and shops and cafes and whatnot, it's right there within walking distance.
When we hire a traffic engineer on our projects, we tell him that we're changing his title from a traffic engineer to a pedestrian engineer. And he needs to be thinking about the pedestrian. The problem lies in the traffic engineers that work for the jurisdictions whose job is only to move cars at efficient and rapid pace. And it takes the political will of the elected officials and the planners to override that. And we've got to break that whole concept of the cars are more important than pedestrians.
Main Street is a great urban artifact. It's in England it was a high street, but it's got, hundreds of years of history and tradition. And the scale of it never changes because the scale of your body doesn't change. The distance that you can see and recognize a face doesn't change. And that's the distance across the street. The moment you start adding 6 lanes to that, a lot of people say, well, gee, wouldn't it be convenient if we could put 6 lanes down the middle of Main Street? Well, what happens is people can't recognize other people. It loses its social scale.
First, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of life would we like to see happening here? What kind of activities would people likely be doing? Who would they be and where would they go, whatever. We will have to start with life. What kind of spaces would we need for this life? And where can we place the buildings in order to create these spaces? And how can we have the buildings talk with the spaces so that we achieve a city and not a collection of individual buildings? So life space buildings instead of building space no life.
What we're trying to do with our Belmar project is give a suburban city a center. So what we really wanted to provide it with was a physical center of gravity. It had no place that people instinctively knew to go when they wanted to celebrate some great community event or to mourn even a civic loss. I had just moved to Colorado when Columbine High School happened, and it was remarkable to me that nobody seemed to know in that community where to go to gather, and they ultimately ended up gathering in the parking lot of a suburban church, but there was no place to go to mourn, and that that's a horrible consequence of our suburban pattern of building.
want to make wonderful places that people enjoy. Designers help us accomplish that. And we have to pay attention to the details in order to make environments that people love and cherish and stay in and invest in. And that's what design can really do to add value to this notion of, you know, organizing growth in this coherent pattern, but really what brings it to life is paying attention to the quality and the design of places. And what's amazing to me is that we've sort of forgotten about how to make cities with transit as a real amenity. We did that great at the, you know, turn of the 20th century, and then we sort of had amnesia and forgot about that.
In searching for solutions to the problems created by urban sprawl, many cities are turning to their history to find answers. Cities in the early 1900s were by necessity more compact. They offered a rich and diverse pedestrian environment. To provide access to goods and services, neighborhoods evolved with a mix of uses that included residential, commercial, retail, and civic facilities within walking distances. Transit systems connected these neighborhoods throughout the city. This made for easy transport to and from jobs and to entertainment and civic functions as well.
In a way, we have to reinvent what we had naturally in our U.S. cities prior to World War II, given that they were all based on streetcar suburbs and urban centers that had heavy investments in transit. Of course, we ripped all that out after World War II and destroyed it. So now we have to develop our way back to it.
If you decide to focus on rail-based public transportation, you're going to get healthy downtowns, you're going to get greater density, healthier neighborhoods. It takes time. I mean, this doesn't happen overnight.
We're putting way too much effort and attention into this single obsession of how are we going to run the cars by other means at all costs. And that is detracting from all the other intelligent things that we could be doing, like rebuilding a good public transit system of the type that every other civilized nation in the world has, except for the United States.
So the first thing you got to do is say, okay, that's it on the highway side. Now we're going to begin to build a first-class alternative, which, by the way, will also help to decongest the highways for those who must have highways, and many people do. I mean, you can't say to those folks, tough, you're just going to have to sit there all day long. But the best way to decongest highways is to give people an alternative.
Part of the problem of our lives now is that they tend to be regional. We have our social life, our economic life, the environment that we experience, all of that is regional in scale. It's not the scale of a neighborhood. It's not the scale even of a city. It's what actually combines us. And so we seem to be leading larger lives than you can capture in a single neighborhood. So a more walkable place is a place that has the extension of transit. So the real success is that transit environments breed short pedestrian trips. And the short pedestrian trips combined with the transit are what really offset the use of the automobile.
You know, my vision of transit is it allows us to have a sequence of dense hubs of activity. So people live, people work, they can go to movies or get a cup of coffee, all in one spot, so that they don't, when they walk out and are seeking something, they don't have to get in their car. If you can walk everywhere and get what you need, then all of a sudden a lot of the bad parts of economic growth go away. You know, you don't have the pollution, you don't have the traffic jams, you have a much more sustainable life.
Really is a combination of combining transit with housing development, with our schools, with our land use planning, with our environmental planning, with our economic development planning. I don't believe in separating transit vision from the city's vision. The transit vision is a part of our whole vision on how we plan to develop for the next 50 to 100 years.
Wherever a transit vehicle stops, be it at a station or be it at a major bus stop, for example, there is an opportunity to create place. place is a way we describe the activity that goes along in that facility. Sometimes it's as simple as a newsstand and a cup of coffee. Sometimes it can be complicated commercial transactions and high-rise or mid-rise condominiums above first floor commercial. When that type of development occurs, particularly let's say around a rail station, it not only increases the local tax value for the local community, but it provides a ready source of riders for the public transit system. People who live in what's called transit-oriented developments, such as might occur with a mid-rise condominium adjacent to a transit station, use public transit much more often than do people who don't live in a similar situation. The benefits of that are obvious then. That means fewer auto trips, that means less auto congestion, that means lower air pollution, that means less reliance on unstable and very expensive foreign oil, and a whole host of other benefits. So the notion of developing at or near public transit stations is a very efficient use of land and a very good return on the public investment by attracting the private investment to that site.
As the price for fuel to our automobiles increases, so will the demand for neighborhoods near public transit. This new demand is already increasing property values in these neighborhoods. This benefits cities, but can lead to gentrification. The risk that lower-income families will be displaced is a major concern, because it is likely that they will be forced into areas that are not well served by transit. This will force them to dedicate even larger portions of their income to transportation. This is a serious issue that cannot be ignored and must be given a priority if these neighborhoods are to be successful for everyone.
Livable communities are great, but you have to have enough livable communities for everyone to benefit from. So it's not just about having one portion of a city look really great while the other one is suffering. You need to have enough of that for everyone to be able to really have a great quality of life for everyone in that community.
When I look at the demand for housing near transit over the next 30 years, almost half of that demand is coming from low-income households. At the same time, the amount of land that's available for building these neighborhoods around transit is insufficient. And if we can help lower-income households by giving them the opportunity to live near transit, to walk to the transit station, to connect to their job via transit, we're helping them avoid the cost of owning a car, essentially kind of putting aside $10,000 a year that they would have to be spending if they were located out at the periphery of the region.
A place needs to be diverse. Who's there and what's there? Diverse in use and diverse in user. You don't want enclaves where this is where just all the singles are and this is where all the elderly are. I mean, this idea of designing whole communities around age groups or income groups. When we isolated low-income household, we created cultures that were totally dysfunctional. So only mixed income, mixed age group neighborhoods really survive over the long term and succeed over the long term.
Public transportation enables Americans to have choice. There are many Americans, for example, that cannot drive or that cannot afford to drive. Public transportation gives them an opportunity to participate fully in our society. One of the biggest demographic trends is the explosion of the baby boomers becoming older Americans. Well, we know that when an older American cannot drive, they go to the doctor 15% less than they would if they had access to an automobile. They do social interactions, that is, go to church, go to shopping, participate in community activities at a rate less than half that people are able to drive. So if we continue to rely on only one mode of transportation and don't give people choice, what we're going to find is that we literally have thrown away major segments of our population.
The market dynamics is this: empty nesters from the baby boom generation are now wanting to scale down their houses. They want smaller places to live, and they don't mind the higher density. And then the new generation of between 20 and 30-year-olds, they're holding off on marriage. And therefore, they don't want to live in the suburb, white picket fenced house. They want to live near other people of their age in which they can have socialization with. And that's why you're seeing cities like behind me booming with residential development.
Our nation's history with the automobile and our love for the freedom it provides dictate that we will not abandon it anytime soon. As global competition for energy resources continues to grow, along with our own population, it will become increasingly necessary to re-examine our energy policies. This is our opportunity, not only to curb fuel consumption and pollution, but to improve the quality of our lives.
There is a tremendous to-do list for us of tasks that we face, of things that we can do and have to do and ought to do and should do, and we don't have time to sit around wringing our hands and recriminating over it. We have to fix the railroad system in America, fix public transit so that we can get from one town to another or one city to another. We have to reform the way we do farming and agriculture in this country, because industrial agriculture is going to fail. And we're going to starve if we don't do it, if we don't start producing more food close to home. You know, we're going to have to change, we're going to have to inhabit the landscape differently. We're going to have to change the way we live. This is a huge set of tasks. And it's not as though they're incomprehensible. But you know, are we actually going to face them, or are we going to be dragged kicking and screaming into this, you know, and how disorderly is this process going to be?
The whole issue of being able to trade in the car, at some level, people are going to keep their keys. They're going to keep their keys until they're, you know, you're not going to be able to pry them out of their hands, because they're wedded to the choice, wedded to the flexibility and convenience of that. And they're willing to pay for the car, to put gas in the car, insure the car, maintain the car, and those costs they'll assume. And there's people like that that will say, I am not over my dead cold body gonna let go of my keys. Okay, fair. But there's a lot of people who say, you know what? I can use that cost for my mortgage. I could use that cost to pay for education for my children. So they're beginning to add up those costs and say, you know, for 4 wheels, I don't think I want to spend that. I would like to spend it on something more valuable to me. Travel, health, education. And those are choices that people right now, that's what I'm talking about, is having the choice to be able to make, because they have redundant systems available to them.
It's not just about transit versus the automobile. We need both types of systems. It's how can those systems work best to give Americans the right choice, the right opportunities to make their lives better. There's no value in transportation, only the value that transportation brings to people's lives.
Let me give you a political perspective, because we don't talk about the politics of rail and mass transit enough. But we have a choice. It's almost like related to your own body. You can wait until the pain arrives and then change then, but you've probably waited too late, and it's going to be awful expensive, and it probably won't work. Or you can anticipate the pain coming, change now. when it's cheaper, when you can still have the strength to do it, when you have the energy to do it. And it'll most likely work if you change now, anticipating the pain that's going to come down the road. Now, the dilemma with doing it now, though, it's a harder sell. And it's not really for this generation, it's for the next generation. And that's not feasible for politicians who are elected every 2 or 4 years. That's not actually feasible many in the private sector who have to show their returns every year. But in the long run, if you anticipate the pain and look at transit now as opposed to looking at when you're reacting to the congestion of 20 years from now, then I think you'll be a more competitive city 20 to 30 to 40 years from now. But one of your jobs as a politician is to prepare your city for the next 50 years, not necessarily for the next election.
You know, one of the great things about the New Urbanist movement is that they recovered a large body of knowledge that America had thrown into the garbage can of history about how to design and assemble and fix places that are worth living in. And so that knowledge has come back to us. We now understand again, you know, after about 5 decades of only using statistical analysis and traffic engineering to build these everyday environments, you know, we've now recovered a lot of knowledge and information and expertise and artistry for how to do it in a way that works better, that's more psychologically rewarding, that's more spiritually rewarding, that's probably more economically sustainable.
To be in a place to be able to help them not only be part of the vision of what they want, but to be able to build that and bring the bricks and mortar in place to give that meaning is unmeasurable.
To me, I think the biggest success would be to have people who had no opinion before to have new insight and new understanding that things could be different, and there are different ways to do it, and there are good reasons for doing it differently that aren't going to inconvenience them, that aren't going to cost more money, but that are actually could create greater convenience for them and give them more money to spend on other stuff besides a car or whatever.
I'd love to imagine flying over in a small aircraft or a very energy efficient small aircraft. And you would see these little pockets of these villages of 8 and 10 and 12 and 14 and who knows, 18-story buildings all around, each one around a transit stop, so that you have the maximum opportunity for people to get what they want without having to get in a car. And you know, as young people move out here and aren't growing up with cars, the probability that they could live in one of these little nodes, one of these little villages, and have a social circle that's connected almost like jewels on a necklace, where they could go from one to the other and have a high likelihood that they would have someone interesting, let's say it's a guy they want to date, if it's a woman or whatever, that their social life could not have to be pulled off in some direction where you need a car.
If we can make the case that this is more healthy, it's better for us, and it can be delicious. You know, Alice Waters talks about a delicious revolution. It can be pleasant, it can be pleasurable, it can be fun, it can be comfortable. Then I think people will be more willing to demand it.
You know, and the good news is we have, 2,000 years of urban design history to guide us in how to create places that really work on all those levels. And the good news is there's a growing awareness that there needs to be a fundamental change.
We have to do better than what we've been doing. We absolutely have to be doing better because it's the future.